G'day guys, and today we're going to be having another look at Australian economics. The last video I did on this seemed to get a lot more views than normal, so this seems to be something that people are at least interested in. So before we were looking at Australian wage growth, and today I want to have a look at interest rates. So specifically what the interest rates are, what they've been in the past, why they are what they are, and the effects this will have on the Australian economy. As always, this is just my own independent analysis. I don't have any formal economics training or even a uni degree or that sort of thing. This is just me having a look and coming to my own opinions based on, again, my own amateur knowledge. If I am wrong, please correct me down in the comments. So we'll start off by having a look at the Australian GDP growth rate. So I've just grabbed this information from 2000 to 2019 because we're talking about the more recent era. We're not looking at like a historical analysis or a look at trends over time. We're just looking at more recent data. And so what we can see is that compared to other nations, especially the big exporting nations like China and Indonesia and India and that sort of thing, the Australian GDP growth rate is pretty damn pathetic. It's sitting around 1%, it's been 2%, almost 2% in the past. But again, comparing to the big exporting nations, which have like GDPs of 5%, 6%, the United States is around 3%, 2%, has been 4% some quarters. We can see that Australia is seriously lagging behind in its growth rate. So this is a problem, not just for the Australian consumer or the average Australian family, but for the Australian government. Now we've got to think about, in Australia we have a very centralised system, not as centralised as Venezuela with mostly state industry and constant nationalisation and that sort of thing, but the Australian government does have a very heavy hand in the economy. We obviously have central banking. The Australian government shuffles around a lot of money, distributing money here and there and that sort of thing and trying to incentivise business. They've got their finger in the pie. They're meddling around with it. And so obviously the Australian government or various administrations want to keep their hand on power. As we know, power as addictive as cocaine. So they need to do at least a decent job in the short run in order to get elected. And what the operative strategy of various Australian administrations, their operative strategy in order to kickstart the GDP or to bolster the economy is to cut Australian interest rates. If we have a look at this graph here, we can see a general downward trend over interest rates over time since the turn of the century, with a massive drop after the GFC. Now let's think about what cutting interest rates actually do. So if we have a pretty pathetic GDP and pretty pathetic wage growth, if we had as we looked at last video, well, what you can do is cut interest rates in an attempt to stimulate business growth. Now, what would happen if, when you cut interest rates, it becomes cheaper to borrow money from the bank? Now, if it's cheaper to borrow money for the bank, then it is cheaper for businesses to expand. They can, borrow $1 million and use it to buy a whole lot more equipment, build more amenities. Maybe they build a second branch to their restaurant chain or something like that. This means that they can create more jobs, hire more staff, and ultimately generate more money. And this means, across the nation that Australia is generating more money and its GDP will increase. So that appears to be the Australian government's operative strategy for at least bolstering the GDP. So they've massively slashed interest rates down to a record low of, I believe, 1.25%. So that's the plan, massively cut interest rates, attempt to incentivize businesses to expand, and also incentivize people to spend more money because it's, not worth it as much to put money in the bank because interest rates are low, so you may as well spend that money. And is it working? Well, if we have a look at obviously the Australian consumer spending, which gives you an idea of whether this is working, because obviously if people are spending more money, then the economy is growing. We can see that over time, the consumer spending is increasing at a steady pace. We can see that slight drop off after the GFC back in 2008, which correlates to the massive drop off in interest rates. So what may have been observed is, oh no, consumer spending is dropping. We don't want this downward trend. Let's massively cut interest rates to incentivize spending, and that's seemed to have got it back on the right track. So consumer spending is increasing over time, which seems like a good idea. But again, looking back at the GDP growth rate isn't really tracking upwards. It's sort of slumping in the middle. It has recovered from the GFC and it's stabilized, but it's not exactly going up and up. And this doesn't fill me with great confidence. Now, I don't completely understand why this would be the case, because again, I'm not a massive expert or anything. But if the government is trying this hard to incentivize spending, slashing interest rates multiple times in a row to record low levels, and the GDP is barely expanding, what does this mean for Australia long term? Is this a long term strategy? Can this work in the long run, or will there be some sort of boom and bust cycle? The way I envision a free market system working is a sort of oscillating pattern between businesses borrowing, spending, and saving. Because if we think about it, if businesses are incentivized to borrow, they're going to obviously spend a lot of money, expand their businesses, as we've explained, but there comes a point where they need to pay this money back to the bank or any other money lending institution, so they're going to have to go through a saving period. Now, during this saving period, they're obviously not going to be spending a lot of money, so the businesses won't be expanding as much. So there's this sort of oscillating pattern between expansion and not stagnation, but sort of maintaining a level of acceptable business practice to save money to pay off your loans. And then once you hit that point, and once you're stable again and you start generating excess money, well, then you can expand your business again. So when I don't see this free market system, this self-correcting free market system, it's very important to point that out. The free market is self-correcting. It's like a feedback mechanism, just like we see in nature and that sort of thing. What happens when this system is not allowed to take place? Now, I don't actually know if there are any dramatic long-term consequences of this, whether we're capable of producing massive distortions in the market with our very short-term fixation on stimulating economic growth, but that is what I'm worried about. I'm worried that some sort of enormous bust cycle is coming, like another GFC, for reasons I don't really understand. But I can use an example of, say you have a section of coastline or a beach, and obviously the tide comes in and out, that level of water moves up and down, and for some reason you find it inconvenient that the water comes up, the tide comes in. So you're like, okay, we're going to push the ocean back and we're going to build a big wall so the tide can't come in. And maybe that's great for a period of time and people can explore the largest section of beach and it's great, or whatever. It only works for the purpose of the example. Will you get to the point where, because that tide mechanism can't take place, some sort of massive distortion occurs? Maybe the local mangrove system is damaged. Obviously, mangroves are reliant on the tidal systems for them to work, to bring in sediment and that sort of thing. Maybe the wall breaks due to build-up of pressure and there's a huge tsunami or something like that. I don't actually know, but that's what I'm worried about. I am concerned when centralized groups are controlling things, because obviously you centralize things, it becomes attractive to people who want to be abusive with that sort of power, and also it increases the likelihood of massive consequences if failure occurs. Because if we think about a very free market decentralized system, if one bit of it fucks up, well, it's sort of contained within that own fuck up. Like, you have multiple little bits of businesses all controlling various bits of the economy. If one of them fucks up, well, that sucks for that business, but the rest of the economy can keep chugging along. But when you have a centralized system that sort of has its hand in everything, controlling price and interest rates, and obviously this has a roll-on effect to wage growth and that sort of thing, what happens when that centralized system fucks up? Well, the consequences are far-reaching and potentially far more dire, because if it has its hand in everything, then everything collapses when it fucks up. And that's what I'm essentially concerned about. It's a concern that's both personal and of a wider perspective, because I'm an apprentice for my company, and obviously if they need to trim some fat, they might just get rid of me because I'm the least skilled, least valuable worker that they have. I'm an apprentice. I'm not a fully qualified tradesman. So obviously if the Australian government is mucking around and is going to fuck up the economy, then that might affect me on a very personal level. But beyond that, it might affect obviously the whole nation as a whole, or it will affect the whole nation as a whole, and potentially hundreds of thousands of people could suffer for the mistakes of a few, rather than having a very decentralized system, whereas one bit fucks up, well, that bit just gets sliced away and something else replaces it, which is a much more sustainable system in my mind. So I guess to end this video, I'm just going to pose a question out to you all watching here today, the viewers. Tell me what happens, because I don't really know. Tell me what happens, what the logical consequences, what the long-term consequences of this model, this economic model the Australian government is engaging in. We're highly incentivizing spending and we're not incentivizing saving. Is this a big problem where we're going to incentivize businesses to rapidly expand and then maybe something goes wrong for reasons I can't quite understand, and businesses don't have a whole lot of money saved up, well, businesses as well as individuals, and then businesses need to save, but they can't because they've spent all their money, they've been incentivized to borrow. Are we going to end up with some sort of collapse like that where everyone owes money but no one can pay it back, just like the GFC? Please tell me, because I don't know, and I'd really like to know, because then if I know, I can make more videos and help make more people aware, and hopefully we can affect some sort of change. So yes, leave me your thoughts and feedback down in the comments below. Thanks all for sticking around, and have a good one.